Hello, and welcome to Fundamentals of Sustainability for the Busy Leader. Hi, my name is Mike Herod, and I'm honored that you're here with me today. This course shouldn't take about an hour, and really my intention is to really demystify and simplify sustainability and how you can use it in your company today. Everything I want to talk about today is scalable. It works today, it works at a small org, it works at a medium orgs. I've seen it used and I've implemented it in global orgs. So it's very much scalable. It's very much adaptable because again, sustainability is really a philosophy, a decision philosophy. So I'm really excited. These videos are kind of raw and just me off the cuff. So please excuse me and forgive me for that. But everything in here is built over 20 years. I've been driving sustainability performance through global orgs, and there's a lot of bumps and bruises that I got along the way. So I want to share those wins with you so that you can increase sustainability and really realize that sustainability is not this mystical thing out there. And you don't need to be a tree hugger. You can, because I believe, when everyone operates their business using sustainability, it can really be a force for good. And you can make a ton of money at the same time. So thank you for your time. I look forward to seeing you next slide. So what we're introducing into this is because really what sustainability does, it builds on the profit you're already focused on within your org. Sometimes it's called a triple bottom line. Sometimes it's called the 3 Ps, the three-legged stool. There's, 100 different ways that people describe it. But at the bottom of all of it is it comes to really the balance between the financial performance of the company, the planetary impacts of your operations and your product, and of course, the social impact that you have, both from a customer standpoint, community standpoint, and supply chain. Okay, because really that sweet spot is balance. You don't want to trade off. For example, you don't want to have a product that is super green, super cheap, but you're happen to employ your subcontractors, your subs of your subs are using slave labor and forced labor because they can keep the labor prices down. Obviously, that's terrible for everyone. It's terrible for your brand. On the other side, you don't want to build a product that is, employees are grossly overpaid. It's, great for the planet, but it's so expensive, nobody's going to buy it. So what good is that? So really, sustainability, the triple bottom line is really, you want to find that sweet spot. And we talk about a workbook later in the presentation that'll kind of help you kind of decide how you work through that. But really, the point I want you to take away from this is really balance. It's like real estate, location, location, location. When it comes to sustainability, it's balance people, balance planet, and balance profit. If you've ever done a Google search for sustainability terms, I'm sure it just made your head spin. There's 1,000 terms out there. The acronym soup can just really drown you. But what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides is really the most important ones you really need to focus and zero in on. Everything else out there is invaluable, but some of it's just noise. So for the purpose of this fundamentals course, I really kind of want to dive into about eight topics and 8 subjects. The first one is greenwashing. We're going to talk about this more in depth towards the end of the course, but don't do it. Don't risk it. It's not worth it. That's all I got to say about that. We'll talk about more later. Carbon footprint and net zero kind of go hand in hand. Really, carbon footprint is and we'll talk about it a little more later, but for this slide is think tailpipes and smokestacks. So that's of your direct operations, the power companies, your suppliers, basically everything that gets burned and emits something into the atmosphere. That's your carbon footprint. Net zero is really kind of balancing that. We'll talk a little bit later. Circular economy has been the buzzword last year. I think the buzzword, it will continue into 26, 27, 28, 20, all the way up to 30 or more, because the market's really waking up to the fact that when a product is built, it's on the manufacturer and the designer to figure out what happens when that product's end of its life. It's not the consumer's problem. It's the manufacturer. We're already beginning to see it in the retail space. in the consumer's goods space, where customers are basically holding, their car seat manufacturers and the clothing manufacturers responsible for, like, hey, you made this product, how do I recycle it? Another thing is CSR. CSR is an old term, dates back to about the mid 80s, is really kind of started to take off. CSR was kind of born out of environmental movement of the 60s and 70s. And what CSR does is it really helps a company balance the social impact, like the people of their workforce, against the environmental. You don't hear CSR much anymore. It's kind of evolved into sustainability, and of course that evolved into ESG, which, by the way, ESG and sustainability are completely different. I'll talk about that in another training course. But really, again, don't get confused by the jargon. We'll talk about a few on the next slide. All right. So in the previous slide, I talked about sustainability, ESG. So sustainability, again, is the balancing of the people, the profit, and the planet. All right. ESG, think of it as sustainability plus the G in realistic terms. I mean, if you really boil it down, they're pretty much the same thing. The G brings the governance on board. Basically, it's that stick. Because what was happening in the last 5 years or so, has just been a lot of greenwashing, a lot of claims, a lot of programs just kind of sped up and they kind of pittered, like there was no accountability. So ESG came on about 3.5, 4 years ago now, with the G, that governance. And that we're going to talk more about this in depth. That really gives the teeth and the strength within a program, and it shows the market that's not just some check the box exercise, but the company really wants to do good about it. An LCA really is, when we talked about circular economy in the previous slide, an LCA, when a company makes a claim about the end-of-life attributes or the environmental impact of a product, it must be grounded in data. An LCA gives you that data, right? It's not you as a builder saying it's green or it's recyclable or whatever. You basically give another firm, an outside firm, carte blanche to take your product down to the design phase, put everything through massive calculators, and they basically give you a menu of performance areas to perform, but also show you what the impact is. It's validation. We're going to talk more about that at the end of the presentation, but really gives you that validation. If you want to talk circular economy and end of life, LCA is where you start, and that kind of gives you that menu. We talked about carbon in a previous thing. This is carbon in a geek mode. So when you hear carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, they're reported by scopes. So there's 3 scopes: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. In the simplest form to remember, scope 1 is tailpipes and smokestacks of your direct operations. So these are facilities you own or have direct control over, right? So at least office space isn't scope 1. Right, a manufacturing location that you own is scope 1. Company cars is scope 1, right? If you've got a generator at a site, that's scope 1. Scope 2, again, I'm talking kind of general broad terms, but to kind of give you an idea of kind of how they lay out. Scope 2 is the tailpipes and smokestacks of the power company. So if you buy 1,000 kilowatts of electricity, that power plant, the greenhouse gas emissions, they kicked into the atmosphere, right? There's a bunch of gases, and we can get really geeky. We won't go down that. But basically, the amount of carbon they kicked out to give you your juice, that's your scope 2, right? So again, smokestacks and tailpipes of the power company. Scope 3 is the gorilla. It's everything else. I mean, it's literally everything from your supply chain, manufacturing, logistics, your waste, product use, end of life, everything falls into scope 3. So if you think about it like an iceberg, scope 1 is what you see above the waterline. All right. Scope 2 is the mass floating underneath the water. And scope 3 is the water, right? That's how big scope 3 is. Scope 3 is massive. There's a growing movement to separate scope 3 into subdividing it, because it currently is subdivided, but there's a bigger pull to really kind of create a scope 4 and future scopes. But really, yeah, scope 3 is the gorilla. It's the hardest. Most people, they delicately walk through that. I always recommend customers, when we're first talking about carbon, let's just hold off on scope 3 for now. Let's focus on 1 and 2. We can kind of dip into scope 3, your logistics, your waste, kind of that kind of stuff. But if we really want to lean into it. Let's get scope 1, 2 cleaned up, and then we can work on scope 3. But again, ESG evolved from sustainability, and LCA for end of life, and of course your scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions are directly tied to your carbon. Thank you.